Hello, my name is Miriam Churchill, and I am the Executive Director of Parents for Peace, and we are pleased to host this discussion today. Thank you for joining us. Parents for Peace is a public health nonprofit that supports families concerned about loved ones becoming involved in hate and extremism. Our mission is to educate the public to prevent extremism, hate, and bigotry and develop concrete solutions. We want to take a moment to honor that today is the 5th anniversary of the shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Last Friday, June 12th, was the 4th anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. And we are now in the 3rd week of protests being held as a result of the death of George Floyd and others. These devastating events are stark reminders that racism and bigotry are unfortunately alive and well, and that we need to make a stronger commitment to fighting them. This is why today's conversation on addressing racism and bigotry is so important. Since the recent protests began, our national helpline has received an increased number of calls. The helpline is a resource for families and communities who are worried about a loved one involved with hate and extremism. Their concerns are understandable and valid. This deep grief and anger that young people are feeling right now put them in danger to be exploited by supremacist groups. From the calls, it is clear that issues of race and bigotry and loss are increasing the risk of young people being groomed for different kinds of supremacies. Parents for Peace work is based on its network of families touched by extremism and former extremists. Thanks to the resilience of our members and our racial, religious, and political diversity, we have been able to come together and find strength and purpose to turn hate into love and compassion. Our co-founder, Monica Hawley, says that Parents for Peace is a family that provides a judgment-free zone, though the rest of the world is not. Painful issues are often at risk of becoming politicized. As a biracial person, half African Muslim and half French white Christian, I know firsthand how complex they are to address, to address this kind of the bigotry and racism, especially when it becomes a political issue. When we hurt, we often turn against each other instead of coming together. While this anger is understandable and often justified, we would do well to be as constructive as possible with that energy. It is our hope that people choose to take on the responsibility of proactively contributing to long-term healing and reconciliation, even if you don't consider yourself a racist or have direct experience with racism or bigotry. These are issues that affect all of us, regardless of whether we are an unwitting offender, victim, or bystander. And in the age of social media, it is necessary to point out that doing something meaningful doesn't mean just social media posts and emails, but rolling up your sleeves and wading into the uncomfortable waters with face-to-face engagement on really sensitive and uncomfortable issues, which is scary. The purpose of today's event is to inspire you to take that scary plunge, which we hope to do by giving you examples and insights of how you can productively approach these thorny issues with your families, friends, neighbors, and co-workers. While today's webinar discusses general strategies and tactics for doing this, we at Parents for Peace offer customized workshops and webinars for private audiences, and want to learn. And if you want to learn how you can best address bigotry and overcome it in ways specific to the people you want to reach. I would love to work with you on something specific to your needs. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you are interested in one of these events, or if you want to hear about other products and services we offer. Today we have an outstanding group of panelists, but first I would like, we are honored to have Congressman Bill Keating of Massachusetts to introduce today's discussion. Congressman Keating represents Massachusetts' 9th Congressional District, which encompasses South Coast, Cape Cod, and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Congressman Keating has been a long time and an enthusiastic supporter of our work. And I want to thank him for his leadership leadership in bringing people together on issues that can unite us all. We value his support for our work. Even though he cannot join us live today, he insisted on sending us the recorded video you are about to see. This dedication to the issue is a testament of his personal passion for finding common ground and pragmatic solution to these devastating problems.
Good afternoon, I'm Congressman Bill Keating. We're part of this virtual meeting. I wish we were in person, but the issues we're discussing here today aren't virtual. They're very real, and they're of core concern to our country, particularly right now as so many Americans have gone to the streets in peaceful protest to change some of the systemic racism and hatred that exists in our country. And indeed, that is the purpose of today's meeting. I want to thank Parents for Peace for sponsoring this. And it comes at a time of another tragic time in our country's history. It's the 5th anniversary of the shootings that occurred at the Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And joining us in the panel is Reverend Sharon Washington Risher, whose mother, Ethel Lee Lance, and 2 of her cousins and friends were killed in that shooting. Let's remember them and commit ourselves to change so that these kind of senseless killings will never happen again. We move forward in the aftermath of that to close the Charleston gun loophole, which passed the House but has languished in the Senate. But today, we understand in our meeting that real change cannot occur simply through legislation, but we have to change minds and hearts and indeed change our culture. And the people gathered at this meeting today represent solutions to all of these issues, something very close to me. Before I was a congressman, I was a district attorney. I tried to move forward in much the same effort, bringing in law enforcement and police chiefs, bringing in criminologists and sociologists, bringing in victims so they could tell their stories, bringing in the faith community. So all these ingredients for change are here today in our panel and then some. I believe that as we move forward now, we have to address those changes in a way that's practical and personal. So the people that are here sharing their stories, their expertise are critical for that change. I am very proud to be a small part in introducing today's panel and moving forward, but I also want to be aware of this. Our job will never be finished. And that is not something that should be a daunting possibility, but something that inspires all of us to continue to move forward. I want to thank all of you for your efforts. Some of them very difficult, some of them life-changing that you will share with all of us. Others still being able to tell others what the problems are that we're facing and moving ahead in that regard. I'm optimistic that we can find solutions, but I'm also much aware of the fact that many of the issues we have are ingrained. They've been ingrained in us for generations at a time. They don't change easily. But we can change laws, but we have to change hearts as well. So I wish you well with today's panel discussion. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for taking so much out of your own lives, sharing that experience, that knowledge, that understanding, and moving our country forward.
Thank you very much, Congressman Keating again. And now I have the pleasure to introduce our moderator. So Dr. Frank Straub is the Director, National Police Foundation Center for Mass Violence Response Studies. He has led studies of mass shootings in San Bernardino, Kalamazoo, Orlando, Parkland, and the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He has also led reviews of the police response for First Amendment protests in Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., and Charlotte. Dr. Straub served for 30 years in federal, state, and local law enforcement. His community policing, youth violence prevention, and police reform efforts have been recognized by the Obama White House in testimony before Congress, presentation at national and international conferences, and in numerous articles. Thank you, Dr. Straub, for being the panelist today, for moderating today.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this very, very important event that is sponsored by Parents for Peace and in collaboration with the National Police Foundation and our panelists. Before we start and before I introduce our panelists, if any of you have any questions, please submit them to us via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists and we'll respond to your questions at the end of the session. We may not get to all of your questions, and in the event that we don't, we have recorded and we will record all of them, and we will follow up with you through email and other venues to make sure that we answer each and every one of your questions, because they are very important to us, and sharing the questions and the answers with participants is also incredibly important to further the dialogue around these challenging issues. I'd like to introduce our panel. Today's discussion initially will be led by Chief Reggie Burgess. Chief Burgess is the police chief in North Charleston, South Carolina. He took over his department in the wake of the Walter Scott shooting. Chief Reggie Burgess will talk about his background and his family, his experience in policing, and how the Charleston church shooting and his appointment as the chief after the Walter Scott shooting has been impactful on his life. Chief Burgess will be followed by Reverend Sharon Washington Reicher. Reverend Reicher lost her mother, Ethel Lee Lance, as well as two cousins and a childhood friend after the shooting at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church on June 17, 2015. After Reverend Reicher's remarks, Ahmed Mohammed, who is a member of Parents for Peace, a peace activist, a cartoonist, and a youth educator based in Minneapolis, will share his reflections and comments and thoughts regarding the current state of affairs in our country, in particular give us insight into his interactions with the Minneapolis Police Department. And finally, Arno Michaelis, sorry, I butchered your name, Arno, is also a Parents for Peace member and a former white nationalist leader. Arno has turned his emotions, his energies, his thought, and his heart to working in youth resilience and becoming an expert in helping to de-radicalize extremists throughout the country. He is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So with that, Chief Burgess, I would call upon you to make opening remarks in the next 10 minutes and share your thoughts about your life in policing, the events that occurred in Charleston, and your views of policing in these challenging times.
Yes, sir. I'd like to first of all thank Parents for Peace and the Police Foundation for allowing me to be here today, to be a part of this. The Lord is good because he surrounds you with good people. I started my career in 1989, and I'm a little not traditional as you would see it, because I came off a football field in college. Like some of the chiefs and sheriffs, they actually were all really involved with law enforcement at an early age. Mine was sports, and that's how I went to college. So when I came home in '89, prior to '89, when I would come home and to visit, I saw my neighborhood, my community. Now, the community that I grew up in is called Liberty Hill. In 1871, 5 years after the Civil War, 4 black men who were freedmen actually went to some property owners and asked if they purchase some property. And they did it, and they subdivided it, and they created the first freedmen's community. And it was designed for the freed slaves. So I grew up in that community. The street called Nesbitt Avenue is the same street that my grandfather, the Nesbitt family, actually lived on. So as I'm coming through in college, I would come back home and I would realize I'm speaking to some of the young men that I grew up with. And when I'm speaking to them, they had, some of them were working, some of them were not. But one particular young guy that, spent the night over to my house, and I was his big brother, he told me one day on my porch, my mother has a swing on the porch. And he told me that he couldn't wait until I get out of college because he don't want to help me out to make some money. So I asked him, what job is he working? Because I've been working since I was 13 years old. He told me, he said, man, I'm out on those corners, man. I said, corners? He said, yeah. And he told me he was a drug dealer. So I realized as I was coming home that the landscape that I had left had dramatically changed in North Charleston. And as I was raised, when you walk down the street in any street in my neighborhood, if you saw an older person on the porch, you would never walk by without saying, how you doing, sir or ma'am? You had that respect because you were taught that. And I believe that to this day, that manners would take you further than money would. So I saw that young man getting away from all the things that I knew his parents had taught him because he wanted that fast money. So when I came out of college in '89, I wanted to make a change. I wanted to improve that community that I had grew up in. And I knew it could go back to that, but I need to get out there myself and try to be the role model some ways to the young men and women out there to say, hey, if I did it, you can do it, because I've had the same struggles you did. Now, my background, my great-grandmother was born at the end of slavery. She grew up on the slave plantation here in South Carolina. She couldn't read nor write. She raised my mothers and my uncles because her daughter went to New York, because back then, a lot of African-Americans went up north to make more money to send back home in the South. But my great-grandmother, who had experience living on the plantation as a sharecropper, always told me that education is the way. Without education, there's no options. So that was the drive for me to continue my education in high school. My father, who grew up in the same neighborhood called Liberty Hill, he attended elementary school on Liberty Hill. He attended high school on Liberty Hill. He went to the community center and learned how to swim and play all kinds of sports on Liberty Hill. He went to church on Liberty Hill. He never left Liberty Hill. He bought food and candy, everything on Liberty Hill, because he was raised in the segregated South. When he turned 18 years old, he joined the Army. That was the first time that he'd ever been off the neighborhood that he grew up in. But even his experience of being segregated in school, church, parks and playgrounds, my father taught me and my brothers that you cannot remain Black in this nation. You need to understand all cultures. So if you understand all cultures, you can assimilate yourself in a positive way in society. So he would never allow my brothers and I to think only one way. So that was another push. My mother, who actually was the person in our family that kept everything going, she worked at restaurants in North Charleston. She was the main cook. She worked 3 of them. They would wait until she got to the restaurants. My mother would cook the food and could not sit in the dining area to eat the same food because that wasn't allowed. But she never allowed me and my brothers to accept that. So me being a grown man, I don't allow that with my children either. I disagree with those who speak of racial hatred and racial advantages. And the bigotry involved is a bad thing, whether it is from Black or from white people. I oppose any white extremists preaching hatred of Black people, and I equally oppose Black people who are extremists preaching hatred against white folks. because I know growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in, I saw both sides. And I know it in law enforcement that it exists. The night that the Manual 9 hatred occurred, I was working the streets that night. It was a Wednesday, I believe. I was working the streets. We have churches in North Charleston that have Wednesday service, which is Bible study. So when we heard the call on the police radio that there was a call stating that there was an incident at a church and people lost their lives, the first thing I did as a deputy chief at that time was to call all of the off-duty officers who work at those churches to go by and check with all of the parishioners at the churches. Everybody I told, get on the radio, say which church you're at, the address, and go inside that church. We had to check all the churches in North Charleston and advise the ministers that something was going on, lock your doors. And if they needed us, call us and we would escort them out. When I got further information, they said it was African-American church on Calhoun Street, downtown city of Charleston. Well, growing up here, I never believed that there was an African-American church on Calhoun. Never did. And I've been downtown all my whole life. So when they confirmed that something was going on at the church, I went down to that church. And that's something I'll never forget, going on 31 years. I've seen a lot of things in my life, but never seen nothing like that. So we worked the whole night down there with the FBI, the ATF, City of Charleston, all the agencies, the surrounding agencies. And we worked that because we want to do as much as we could, as fast as we could, so we can capture that individual that was responsible. And the Lord provided that opportunity that he was captured. So I say this. In my oath, it says, I recognize my badge as a symbol of public trust. And I should strive to justify this trust as a law enforcement officer to the best of my ability, so help me God. That's the oath that I swore in 1989. Because this badge is a symbol, but the person behind it needs to do the job that the badge represents. So in closing, I say something that my old principal told me that I believe in this day, and I live by that since I was in the elementary. If we're going to make a change in America, it has to start with the individual. And he said to me, Reggie, if it's to be, it's up to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Burgess. Our next speaker is Reverend Sharon Reicher. Reverend Reicher.
Hello. Thank you, Parents for Peace, for inviting me to be a part of this panel, this much needed conversation. Thank you for your kind words on this 5th anniversary, what I call the Charleston Massacre. 5 years ago, on June 17th, 2015, a young white supremacist walked into Emmanuel AME Church to shoot and kill as many people as he could. They welcomed this young man into the church. He asked to be seated next to Reverend Pinckney, and that's where he was. So after about an hour of reading the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, the parable of the sower, they gathered in a circle for dismissal. While they had their eyes closed and their heads bowed, Dylan Roof took out his Glock 45 and slaughtered them like they were animals. I hadn't lived in Charleston in more than 40 plus years, and I lived in Dallas, Texas at that time, and that Wednesday night kind of was a regular night for me at the hospital. Circumstances happened that I needed to go back to my office to retrieve some death paperwork because I had been working with a family whose grandfather had died, and ran down to my office, and I say that the Spirit of the Lord sent me to my telephone because it was on my desk charging, and I would have kept going. I would not have checked my phone, but I saw that I had 3 missed calls from my daughter, and that put me on high alert because that was something unusual. So I took the time, and I had to go into another little place, you know, because my phone didn't work well in my office. So I went into the conference room and got into the phone corner and called my daughter. And that's when she said my nephew had called from Charleston and said something had happened at the church. And my first question to her was, what church? And she said, Ma, Granny's church. So now I'm even more on alert because I know that was Wednesday night. My mom's opened the doors of that church and closed that night, and I knew that she would be in Bible study. But I was at my job, so I had to go back. I had to deal with the family. I get back downstairs to my office, get into the phone corner, and started calling people. I called my mother's phone. I don't know. I called her phone, and of course it went to voicemail, and I knew she would never hear my message because she didn't know how to get the messages out the phone. I called my sister. She didn't know. She didn't have the TV on, but she said, okay, I'm going to put my clothes on and go down to the church. And that's when the nightmare started for me. I turned on the TV and saw the news that was going on. And I left early from Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, and took me about an hour to get home because I was crying and I couldn't see to drive, and I had to stop my car and park. But I made it home and turned on the television hoping to get some word. And I called my nephew back and was like, Auntie, they won't let us near the church. We don't know what's going on. They just keep saying they're fatalities. They're not saying anything. My sister Nadine had went to the hospital because it was word that people went to the hospital, was carried. But the only person that was carried to the hospital was Reverend Daniel Simmons, because everybody else had died. I fell asleep, and the chaplain called about 2:30, 3:30 Central Time. And when my niece said that the chaplain wanted to talk to me, I knew. I just started to scream. I don't even think I heard what she said to me. So that's how 5 years ago on a Wednesday night, when my life turned upside down. But even in my life being turned upside down, I'm a person of great faith, an ordained minister. So I knew as time started to move on and move past, things started to realizations of things started to open itself up in a spiritual way where before it never did for me, because I was an angry daughter. I was in rage. I was in a fog. I didn't know what to do. Talking about forgiveness was one of the highlights that came out of that tragedy, where the world looked at my sister and others in that courtroom that day when they were given a chance to say to Dylann Roof what they wanted to say to him. And my sister was the first one to say, I forgive you, Dylann Roof. And here I scream and holler again, because I felt like here again, I'm hearing words that I just can't believe. So my journey towards the forgiveness was not as easy as it was for my sister and the other people. It took me a while to reconcile that. So all of this have happened to me, but because of Charleston, there are things that God has seen fit to open our eyes to look at how much more we need to work on racial tensions, how we can't let ourselves be indoctrinated to hate through white supremacy, white ideology groups. God was showing the world that we don't have to riot and tear down our city, because we're going to show the world what could happen if it could really happen every day. That gun sales are through the roof, that the Charleston loophole, the law that would have kept Dylann Roof from buying his gun, has sat on Mitch McConnell's desk. There are so many things that came out of Charleston that are still riveting, and the ripple effect is still happening, because it will always happen until we find a way to be willing to work and live and listen to each other and be authentic, to be willing to hear the hard things, not to fix anybody, but let me walk with you while we figure this out. So in the honor of my mother and those 8 angels that gave their lives for a higher power in that church, the rest of my life will be spent honoring them and teaching people that hate does not win, and the story of those 9 Black souls in that church. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend, for sharing your pain as well as your hope for the future. And we join you and your family today as you celebrate the lives of your mother and your cousins and your friends who passed in Mother Emanuel Church 5 years ago. Our next speaker is Ahmed Mohammed, and he will share with us his thoughts and experiences as a member of the Somali community in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Thank you so much to Parents for Peace for putting this together, and Frank Straub of the National Police Association. Thank you for giving me this platform. And Reverend Sharon Reisha, you almost had me in tears talking about your circumstances and what you've experienced. But we are people of faith, and I will tell you this, what the African Americans taught me in America. God is good all the time, all the time. So you reaching forgiveness is something that I don't know, even I can do that, especially to someone who killed my mother. I mean, you have to walk in those shoes, and I don't think I have that kind of compassion. But then again, you're a reverend. You're trained to be compassionate. Well, Ahmed Mohammed is a counter-ideology platform. Now, if you know, 4 years ago at a nightclub for gays, people got shot because of homophobia. So we decided we're going to do something about Islamic supremacy, which promotes these values of racism, which exist, values of anti-Semitism, which is now growing and becoming a big issue, values of anti-Christianity, people who are Muslims are going after Christians and killing them because their Lord is Christ. It's happening in the Middle East, it's happening in East Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. And then again, we have homophobia, which is old, and every community suffers from it. Now, what we do is we work with kids in terms of making sure that we don't accept any kind of ideological experience, which basically makes them hate one another. Hate is the thing that we most likely are combating. And we do it from a perspective of us being Muslims, because we believe the first principle we should always promote is peace. Peace is fundamental. And if you know anything about the Quran, it mentions peace 2 times before it mentions war. Peace is more important. So we promote that. The second thing we promote is we live in a society. And in this globalized society, what binds me, Ahmed Mohammed, to Miriam Churchill for Parents for Peace, or Arno Michaelis, or you, Reverend Reisha, or Frank Straub, or Chief Burgess, is our democracy. It is our constitution. So we teach that because we value that, and we're saying that is better than what theocrats, people who are trying to create a system based only on religion, excluding everyone else, will not work for us. Because in our understanding, it should include all humanity, not just some. So we go out, promote democracy. And the third value we promote is anti-extremism, whereby we go into schools and we talk to kids. And when we talk to kids, we're not just talking to Muslim kids. In the last 6 years, we've spoken to 50,000 kids across the world. We're talking to white kids. And usually, I'm the first person who tells them, be proud you're white. There's no shame in being proud of being white. White people have contributed a lot to our history and our generation and our society and our culture. Be proud you're white, because I don't want the first person to tell him to be proud of white to be a white supremacist. Same thing with Muslims. We tell them, be proud you're a Muslim. Do not be afraid of what's happening. And our kids, our Muslim kids are black. And they say, look, we're targeted by the police because they think we're criminals. And the federal government thinks we are terrorists. We are stuck in the middle here. And this is the message I tell them. I tell them, look, who's going to be the change maker? This is America. In America, every community that came to this country had their teeth knocked in. No community got a free ride in this country. Everyone had to fight for their space, and everyone had to create that space and create that understanding of that space. Ask the Irish American, ask the Catholics, ask the Asians, ask the African Americans who were brought here as slaves, Jim Crow, all the way down to civil rights to today's George Floyd demonstrations. It is a continuation process. So another thing I did is, why I'm happy to be on this panel is because I worked for the last 2 years with St. Paul Police Department, right across the street, the river, from Minneapolis Police Department. For 2 years I worked with them, and the goal was simple. Simple, create intergenerational change within police department, whereby each policeman has mentored at least 2, 3, 4 black kids in the process of teaching them. And we offer them a video club where they can train them and teach them, but more importantly, play with these kids. Now here's a white cop who knows 3 or 4 black kids. And here's 3 or 4 black kids who know 1 white cop. This is the intergenerational change we are going for, because we want cops to think different and we want our youth to think different. And this is very important. Now, I will share with you what makes my cop. You see, I'm a student of a guy who was a jailbird, who basically got hit, stoned, hosed, got dogs set upon him, spent a lot of time in jails. I think you know him too. He's called Reverend Martin Luther King. All done in the name of change. He said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So here we are, we're telling the police department, we love you. We love you. Because we want you to love us back, because we know that hate of police will not cause the change we seek. You can pass 1,000,000 laws, but if there's hate in our hearts, nothing will change. And how do we talk about love? I'll give you an example. There was a Somali woman, her name is Mama Sophia. Her restaurant survived the pandemic shutdown. When it was shut down, she saved her money and she kept on paying her rent. But she couldn't survive the race riots in Minneapolis. Let me tell you what this woman said. She said, my heart is broken. My mind is broken. She says, I know I can't come back from this, but this can be replaced. Her restaurant can be replaced. George Floyd's life cannot. George's life was more important. That man that got killed in the most inhuman way. I hope he gets justice. Justice. What is justice, man? This lady who lost her entire investment, her business, is basically saying, forget about it. I can always rebuild this, but that guy has to get justice. George Floyd has to get justice. What is justice then? The question is, it's not a matter of putting a few people in jail. It's not a matter of passing laws. I mean, the issue that George Floyd has triggered is just a trigger. It's not the police. It's the inequality that exists with healthcare. It's the fact that here in Minnesota, we own, as minorities, the least amount of housing. It's also access to healthcare. It is also to underfunded education system, which has been training generation to generation of youth who are minority to only work in the low-end jobs. And nothing more than that. No inspiration, no movement beyond that. It is also the question of hospitality and livability. Now, these are all important factors. Now, this woman here, her store got burned down, but let me tell you about my America. American Stoicism. She set up a GoFundMe page. She said, I will need $200,000 to rebuild my restaurant. You know how much she got? $228,000. That is America for you. You see, there is more love in this country than there is hate in this country. That much I know. More of us love than people who do hate, but the difference is those who hate are very vocal on social media, in our platforms, and in our faces. Silence is no longer acceptable anymore. The age of silence is over. For the first time, I am so proud when I go peacefully march, and there's more white kids than there are black kids in the demonstration saying we need justice. That is America for you. There's a lot of good in this country because I came to this country with nothing. But I believe, and I'm biased, and I'm always biased because I believe this country is opportunity. This country is opportunity. This country is liberty. This country is justice. And this country is freedom. I believe in that. And I teach that to kids all across the world. But once in a while, we're reminded where it doesn't exist. George Floyd was one of them. And here we are with the police department, and people are saying, let's defund the police department, let's take them all out, let's check them all out, let's rebuild it. Well, there are good things within the police department that we do. When they do barbecues within the community and they come out and they bring food, that's a good thing. We need that funded. When they come out and do bike rides where they bring the bicycles to inner city kids and take 100, 150 kids on bike rides across the city, we need that funded. We need that community relationship funded whereby programs such as LECPA, law enforcement cadets or young explorers can get funded so that young minority kids can join the police force in the future and become policemen and policewomen. That also needs funding. So when we're rethinking police department, don't throw out all the baby with the water. There's a lot of good things police do. And believe me, I know a lot of policemen who are heroes who really love their community. And also, we see those who don't. So our goal is simple. Our goal is to say, let's drive out darkness, but we can't do it without light. Our goal is to say only love can change us because we were taught by Reverend Martin Luther King, and he experienced this issue worse than we did. And if you could say love is the answer, so can we. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for your sharing such heartfelt words and your experience as a Somali in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and really bringing a message of hope to this conversation. Our next speaker is Arno Michaelis. I did better this time, Arno. I didn't butcher your name. Arno is going to share his journey from white supremacy, white nationalism, to a new life, a life outside of hate.
Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Mrs. Cynthia Graham Hurd, Mrs. Susie J. Jackson, Mrs. Ethel Lee Lance, Reverend DePayne Von Trace Middleton, Reverend Clementa C. Pickney, Mr. Taiwanza Kibwe Diop Sanders, Reverend Daniel Lee Simmons, Sr., and Miss Myra Singleton Quarles Thompson. Five years ago today, those 9 wonderful souls were murdered by a terrified, miserable, cowardly white kid who wallowed in the same kind of victimhood, irresponsibility, and fear that I had once vigorously promoted for 7 years of my life. From 1987 to 1994, I was an organizer and leader of white nationalist hate groups. Just like Dylan Roof, I had convinced myself that white people were the victims in our society. I had convinced myself that white people were oppressed by everyone else. And I lived every day of that 7-year period in a state of intimidation, in a state of fear of my other fellow human beings. Now, when you hear of someone who lived in that world and who thought that way, a lot of things come to mind. A very common thing to come to mind is that maybe he was raised like that, or that he must have had a really horrific childhood to make him so hateful and so violent. I was not raised like that. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood with 2 parents who were together, who loved me very, very much. They let me know that at every turn. I never went hungry. I never took a beating. My childhood was actually pretty idyllic. Now that I'm pushing 50 years old and I've had the grace to travel around the world and meet so many of the amazing people on it, I understand that there are literally billions of children on this planet who would have felt like they won the lottery if they switched childhoods with me. But there was suffering in my childhood, and it was stemmed in my father's alcoholism. My dad's drinking put a lot of pressure on my mother. At times she had to work 2 jobs to keep the lights on and the bills paid in our nice house in a nice neighborhood. Her relationship with my dad sucked. They fought constantly. And some of my earliest memories are being woken up in the middle of the night, hearing my mother screaming in tears at my father to leave her alone. Now, my dad wasn't abusive. He would come home at 2:30 in the morning after bar time and try to get my mom up to talk to him because he wanted to talk because he was drunk. And my mother was exhausted from working 2 jobs. And that's where the screaming and the tears came from. My father has a disease. It's the same disease I have. It's alcoholism. It's a disease that's genetic. It's also environmental. And despite my father's disease, he did the best he could when I was growing up. And in many ways, he was an amazing dad. And he's still a huge supporter of mine, as is my mom. But when I was a kid and I was suffering because of my mom's suffering, I started to distance myself from her and my father. Instead of being a good kid and saying, hey, I love you both, how can I help? I just started to distance myself from them and from all the other adults in my life who loved me very much. And that made my suffering worse. And I started lashing out at other kids. I was a bully on the school bus as early as kindergarten, and I got a thrill from causing havoc at school. I got a thrill when other kids were afraid of me, when their parents were afraid of me. I got a thrill when teachers were afraid of me and the principal of the school was afraid of me. This became an addiction, this lashing out and antisocial behavior. Very similar to my addiction to alcohol. When I started drinking at age 14, I think the first time I drank, I had maybe 4 or 5 beers until I passed out. I drank for another 20 years. By the time I quit drinking in 2004, I could drink 18 beers in an evening and still function the next day. It's an example of how the amount of substance that gets you high that first time you do it doesn't get you high the 10th time you do it. And you have to keep escalating that amount of substance in order to get the same kind of high. My antisocial behavior was the same kind of thing. So bullying kids on the school bus got old. It didn't give me a thrill, so I had to get in fights in the schoolyard. That got old, so I went from fights in the schoolyard to breaking and entering to vandalism, burglary. Started drinking when I was 14. By the time I'm 16, I had been violent since I was a little kid. It was second nature to me. And I was a full-blown alcoholic. My life revolved around obtaining and consuming alcohol. And hate was just another part of the rush. Hate was another part of the thrill that I got from repulsing civil society. And nothing repulses people like a swastika. I knew why people were repulsed by swastikas. I wasn't ignorant of the Holocaust, but I didn't care because all I cared about was getting that thrill. And that's how I became a white nationalist skinhead in 1987 at the age of 16. I was exposed to the ideology through white power music, which I organized my own band and started making myself. For 7 years, I took angry, hurt white kids, and I blamed everything wrong in their lives on black people, on Jewish people, on gay people, on Muslims, on anybody but them. And I did a lot of harm to the world. I did harm to innocent people with my bare hands. I don't know how many disgruntled white kids I wound up and set off into society to hurt people and bring more people into these groups. The 7-year period of my life was the worst period of my almost 50 years. I attempted suicide twice by slitting my wrists. The first time because my mother had told me I was 1/16 Native American. And the second time a week after my daughter was born, because I came home drunk out of my mind and covered in somebody else's blood, and her mother was letting me have it about being a horrible father. It could be argued that entire 7-year period was an ongoing suicide attempt. But I was very, very lucky that throughout that 7-year period, there were very brave people cut from the same cloth as my dear friend and hero, Sharon Risher. People who refused to reflect my hostility and play by my rules. Because everything I did back then was meant to make people hate me. It was meant to provoke hostility. If I wanted them to swing at me. If it devolved to violence, I won, no matter what end of the side of the violence I ended up on. These brave people, like a Jewish boss and a lesbian supervisor and Black and Latino coworkers, treated me with kindness when I least deserved it. And they demonstrated for me how powerful kindness is, how powerful compassion is, how powerful forgiveness is. I've come to understand that these noble qualities of our human existence are not weakness. Far from it, they are weapons. And they must be our weapons of choice against hate in our society. As my brother Ahmed had so beautifully and powerfully elaborated, and as Chief Burgess has, that care for each other is what's most powerful in our lives. The brave people who treated me with kindness led me to a point where I was so exhausted I was looking for an excuse to leave, and I did that in 1994. Since then, I went public with my story in 2010, and I will never forget July 17th, 2015, because as soon as I heard that that happened, I hopped into a Suburban with my friend Pardeep Singh Kalika and his brother Amardeep. Two brothers who I know because a guy from my old gang murdered their father and 6 other people in the August 5th, 2012 Sikh temple shooting. And we drove down to Charleston, South Carolina to bear witness to the suffering. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I just knew I had to be down there and stand and offer myself in service. And when we arrived in front of Mother Emanuel and saw hundreds of people, not just peacefully gathered, but celebrating life, celebrating their faith and their love for each other and their refusal to capitulate to hatred, I completely broke down and lost it. I was a blubbering, sobbing mess who didn't feel like I was going to be much good to anyone. And I'll never forget a black woman about my age, who I guess was from Charleston, came up to me and said, "Hey, you look like you need a hug." And she gave me a hug and comforted me. And from that day forward, the Emmanuel Nine were in my heart. And I've since met my friend Sharon, and we've developed a friendship that's very, very special to me. And I'm incredibly humbled and honored to share this panel with her and my other esteemed colleagues. And I'm very grateful to everyone at Parents for Peace for making it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arno, for sharing your thoughts and opening your heart and your life up to all of us and sharing those incredible stories and emotion. And thank you for the work that you're currently doing. Chief, I know you have another engagement, so I want to grab you before you take off and leave us. Can you maybe very quickly share some thoughts about what you and the North Charleston Police Department are doing in your community to help build bridges, to thoughtfully and respectfully approach the issues that we've been speaking about today?
Yes. The first thing I did, Frank, is I took a look at myself internally, like the panelists have stated. I need to make sure that, my mind was in the right track. So as being a police officer, I've always seen in the city of North Charleston, which our city is predominantly Black, but our police department is predominantly white. And as long as I've been a police officer, whenever somebody came to complain on law enforcement, there's an area that they come into City Hall. And for almost 31 years, the majority of people that come through that door in that spot for almost 31 years to complain on law enforcement look like me, the African Americans. So when the Lord blessed me to have an opportunity to become the chief of police in 2018, my mind was very focused on a lot of things. I knew we had a violent crime problem. I knew we had some systemic issues like poverty. We had a situation where the educational level wasn't up to par. We had a lot of things going on. But as a leader in the law enforcement realm, people ask me, well, you're averaging 20 homicides a year, and 90% of those homicides are Black males, and 90% of the people who perpetrate those are Black males. Are you going to die right into that to try to figure a way out? Because you're black eyed, so you should have the key. You should know how to bring those crimes down. That I care for as much as anybody. But I knew the issue that was plaguing our city was our relationship between our minority community and law enforcement. I knew that. So my whole goal was to flip the whole entire way of doing things. Let's not only put reduction of violent crime as our first priority. Let's put partnership, relationship, friendship, fellowship, any kind of ship that we can ride on to make things better with our community. Let's try to engage that process first. We know how to investigate crimes. We know how to get out in these neighborhoods, but we do not have the cure for the relationship building. Because I really believe, and the Lord's Spirit told me, that if we as an agency can build those bridges between law enforcement and the community, then we will build a bridge so great that the community will buy into and believe us, that we're out looking out for their benefit and help us with the reduction of crime, therefore creating a safe neighborhood. So my goal was to create a great partnership with our community, and then parallel to that, work with our community on strategies and on initiatives to bring crime down while we're working with the community to serve them better. And then the third piece would be, together, law enforcement and the community will create a safe neighborhood. So that was the driving goal for me, Frank. It was like, how do we do it? So in March of 2018, Vaughn McFadden, a young Black male, was hanging out with some friends and he got shot and killed. The same friends robbed him and killed him. And that was the first homicide we had in our city while I was the chief of police. I woke up that morning, I left my house, I called my mother and checked on her. She said, son, these days will come but she said, what you do before these days matters. And she said, you've already out here as a cop. You've been putting in work out there. You've been going to community meetings. You go to events for the community actually come to. You walk the streets. You do community cleanup. You have a lot of things that you're doing in the neighborhood. Now it's time for you to step out and get the community to work with you, to help you out, to stop these homicides. So I said, yes, ma'am, Mama, I'm going to do that. Didn't know how. I had a staff meeting at 9 o'clock that morning. And after I finished staff, I created a sign that said, stop the violence. We all can do it. And I went to the same area that Von McFadden was killed at. And I was walking up and down the street that whole afternoon. And people were blowing their horns at me and, you know, asking me, what you doing? And I showed them the sign and they parked their cars and said, we walk with you, Chief. I said, they asked me, why you doing this? I said, because you thought enough that you want to come walk with me because you're tired of it too. Because see, I believe you read your Bible and you listen to stories back in the day, whenever an oppressed people get tired of being oppressed, they're going to stand up. When the Israelites were in Egypt, they were in slavery. And Pharaoh knew that. He knew how to divide and conquer them. You keep them divided, you will always keep them in slavery. Oh, but when that people come together and they get themselves together and they organize, they make the change. So that is my effort, you know, Frank, is to get the people in the communities to come together with law enforcement to change things as it is in that community. And you know, it's an uphill battle all the time. But when you are in those communities and you are at ground zero, you see how people live. You sit in porches with them. You go to their churches. You come to the community meetings. And you realize that they have the same mindset that you have. They want to live in peace. There's only a small percentage in the communities that are violent. But the majority of people want to live in peace. All you have to do is step out. I'm a leader that I lead from the front. You know, I want to go out there. Hey, I'm going out there. And when I went out there, all the other officers came along. And then the community started stepping up. And, you know, we created a lot of programs with the Police Foundation that exist now that's unlike any program in the Southeast. You know, we were invited to go places to talk about how we had the Walter Scott shooting. And not one bottle was thrown through a window. Not one car burned. No violence. The reason why that happened was because we had developed relationships with the civil rights leaders, with the community members. And when that incident happened, they said, no, the police we have apologized. We knew this department. They are trying to be the department we need. And they weren't trying to do anything to harm that relationship. But we created that relationship a long time before the crisis came. That's what I'm trying to do, Frank. Get out there and create those relationships with the community. So when things does happen, that community said, no, you know, we know them. We can work with them and they do the best at it. And we appreciate it. We have a long way to go, but we're working hard at it so we can actually create a safe neighborhood for everybody to live in. Yes.
Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
Be safe and God bless. And thank you for the tremendous work you're doing.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. God bless all of y'all.
We're also joined on the phone by Officer Sammy Wicks. Sammy and I have gotten to know each other, and I feel very privileged to get to know Sammy. He's employed by the Aurora, Colorado Police Department, and as you all know, they also experienced a horrific event in a theater several years ago. Sammy is assigned to the Crisis Intervention Unit. And that unit is doing some incredibly important work. And I'd like Sammy to just share that briefly with our audience and talk about proactive measures to help and identify persons in need of services, to connect them to services, to de-escalate crisis. So Sammy, if you're available and willing, I'd like to have you just comment on the role that you and your team play in Aurora, Colorado.
Hey, Dr. Straub. Hey everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you all today, but a mix of emotions, kind of remembering the incident that occurred. Yeah, so I work for the Aurora Police Department. I'm assigned to our crisis response team, and essentially the work that we're doing right now is partnering with community mental health workers. We have designated police officers that have specialized mental health training, and we go out into the community, get together, and we respond to crisis calls, generally that have some sort of mental health nexus or a substance abuse nexus or a combination of both. And some of these are pretty low risk incidents where people are sort of just dealing with depression, and maybe they've had some life triggers where they've lost a job or they're having family issues, and we try to help them navigate those moments long term, and try to navigate the mental health system as well and get them connected to resources. But some of these incidents are, not necessarily, they don't fall into that category. They're a little bit more high risk. And that can be, youth that are, planning or discussing potentially committing an act of violence at schools, which we've seen far too much of in this country, especially in the past few years. And unfortunately, Colorado has a long history with mass casualty events. It could also be adults as well who are, engaging in extremist activity, sharing propaganda, potentially planning, those sort of, heinous attacks that we're all talking about here today. So far, we've been really successful. We've got a lot of buy-in from different community groups and community members, and it is a constant process of learning to be a good partner to the community. I really have to thank the chief for what he said, because I feel like often in law enforcement, we start these initiatives where we want to partner with community members, and we really dictate the terms of that partnership, and it really doesn't feel like a partnership to some of these community groups. And you can really tell a difference when you don't do that and you really work as partners together. I can't say enough about the kind of initiatives that operate in that way. And we have our issues here, but we're doing our best to do that. And like I said, it's a constant process. We have to be flexible. We're learning all the time, and we're trying to pull as many people as we can in. But yeah, it's been a really good experience so far. And been really fruitful, and we're just looking forward to building more relationships like we have with Parents for Peace and Dr. Frank Straub and others, and continuing to do this work in a way that keeps people safe and also empowers them to really participate in this, because anybody that's listening, whether they're a practitioner or they're a parent or some other sort of family member or friend, I mean, we really all have a role to play in preventing these moments, these tragic moments that we're talking about today. So a lot of it is like, how do we empower ourselves to do that? And we're hoping that we can aid people in being empowered and preventing this kind of stuff.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Arno, we had a question from one of our participants who asked about the increase in extremist recruitment online. And do you see that as more dangerous? Do you see it as increasing hate? If you could just comment on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that haven't changed one bit since I was active 1987 and 1994. The same basic fearful, ignorant story of white people being persecuted and victims, and this is all at the hand of Jews and people of color and whatnot. That's the same. What's different nowadays is the vectors that ideology can reach people through. In my day, I literally had to go person to person. Like, I had to go find Joe pissed off white kid and explain to him that everything wrong in his life is somebody else's fault. It was literally a lot of legwork. Nowadays, because of the internet, because of social media, the ability for hateful ideologies to spread and for suffering, miserable people who are susceptible to falling into these ideologies to connect with those who disseminate the ideologies is exponentially greater. Everybody talks about things going viral, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, so we have like an actual virus event happening, but the hate is very viral in any circumstance. But when you add technology to the mix, it's a lot easier for hate to spread. And I think what that means is that all of us who use this technology have a responsibility to make our social media platforms a place that's not conducive to hate. And we need to look out for each other, to speak up for each other, be mindful about what kind of content we share content that uplifts people and supports people rather than tears people down. And Parents for Peace has been a leader in this space for years and has connected with pretty much all the big tech companies you can tick off. And I will say also that I've done extensive work with Google, Facebook, Twitter over the years, and all those companies really are dedicating an immense amount of time and energy and the work of some very passionate people to make their platforms ones where hate's not welcome.
Thank you, Arno. We received another question, which I'm going to just share some thoughts on very briefly. So one of our participants asked, I live in a small community in New England that has not been directly affected by the national conversation and some of the challenges that we've seen in other cities. And the participant asked, what can I do, right? And my thought is that regardless of where we live, it is incredibly important that in our own way we're activists. We have to challenge hate. We have to challenge racism at all levels. We have to also challenge our police officers, our police departments, at the same time we're supporting them. We need to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I would argue that when we stand on the sidewalk and we watch the parade go by, we're as much as part of the problem as we are to the more vocal people that maybe are inciting unrest. And so I think there are a number of ways, right? We can join the police department as an auxiliary officer. We can engage in youth police activities that Ahmed and other speakers have talked about. We can invite officers from our departments into our churches, into our schools, so that they're not isolated in our communities, but they're drawn in and very much a part of our communities. But the most important issue is just don't stand by. There's that saying, see something, say something. I think it's great. I have always added something that I think is incredibly important. Do something. Don't see something and say something and hope that somebody else is going to do it. You own it. It's on you, and it's incumbent upon all of us, as all of our panelists have expressed, to take that risk, to put ourselves out there and to do something. So I think that would be my thoughts in terms of what we should all be thinking. And I'll very quickly throw that to Ahmed and ask him to share some of his thoughts in terms of police-community relations. We are getting very short on time. If you do have questions that you didn't have a chance to ask today, please email them to Parents for Peace, and we'll make sure that we get back to you in a timely manner with a response. So Mohammed, if I can very quickly ask you, just maybe as somebody who is in the community, who works very closely with the police in St. Paul, to just maybe share some final thoughts that you might have on that before I turn the agenda over to Miriam for her closing remarks.
From my experience working with St. Paul Police Department, they have an outreach program and they have an outreach specialist just specifically designed to just do outreach for them. I've seen the police chief in the mosque talking to imams. He calls all the imams, and I've seen him do it with church leaders, and I've seen him do it with Jewish leaders, and I've seen him do it with atheist community and other communities around there. Whereby they sit down and they say, okay, what's your issues? Not me, the police chief, coming to you, but you tell me what your problems are. One of the things they did, the police chief did for our Muslim community is he holds an iftar dinner, whereby during Ramadan, not only do we break our fast, the police department pays for us to break our fast. And we talk together, we talk about what the community needs to be going forward. Again, activism within the community, meaning that, for example, our women could not swim with with mixed sexes in a swimming pool of the YWCA. So the police chief went ahead and talked to the YWCA and said, can we have one specific day just for women, and so that they can come out and swim, because most of our women don't know how to swim. And like, simple things is what counts. It's not major things that you need to do. It's simple things that you got to do, which progressively you build upon. And the relationship between the police department and the community is impressive. I was shocked when I went the first time to work with St. Paul Police Department, and they knew the kids. I was shocked because I was like, how do you know these kids? You know, have you been dealing with them with law enforcement? Said, no, we've known these kids since they were the age of 6. They're now teenagers. We've been working with them. That is the change we're looking for. It is intergenerational. It is not laws that will change it, but interactions that will change it. And what kind of good quality interaction can we generate? Now, this is a police department across the river from Minneapolis Police Department. I am from Minneapolis. I live in Minneapolis. And I can tell you they do the same things, but the difference is there is the leadership that believes in this stuff. Police Chief Todd Axtell, Assistant Police Chief Paul Lovino, they made it their priority. Their number one duty is community relationship. And they go everywhere, meet everyone, talk to everyone, engage everyone, and more importantly, bring everyone to the table. Do you know how many parents will pull aside the police chief and say, you know what, I'm having problems with my kid, can you send a police officer around to talk to them? And there's no legal documentation of it? Many. I was shocked. I mean, that shocked me. And what I liked is whatever they're doing seems to be working, because we have less problems in St. Paul than we do here in Minneapolis. There is an organizational different thinking here. One is embedded in the community, and the other one will come to the community when there's a headline. It's already too late when the headline is there. You need to build this relationship before. Now you see, if before the headline, I can stand up and speak for St. Paul Police Department and what they've done within the community. And many others will do so. And that the community will understand and appreciate. But for Minneapolis Police Department, none did. None did. And that tells you where the priorities lie.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Miriam, thank you very much for the privilege and the opportunity to moderate this extraordinary conversation, and even more importantly, to be a partner and a collaborator with Parents for Peace in the incredibly important work that you do. And so I'll turn it over to you for your closing remarks.
Thank you, Frank. First of all, I want to say that I am so honored to be part of this incredible community of Parents for Peace. And I just want to remind that our wealth in this organization is that our members come from different racial, religious, and political diversity. And I think that this is what makes us different. I'd like to thank, our incredible panelists, and thank you for your voices and building bridges, instead of, turning it against each other. We need those voices, especially right now. And also I want to thank every participant that joined us for our first webinar. This is the first one we are hosting to start this important conversation. And the very first, and I'm hoping to many different conversation to come, because this is time to have this very, very essential conversation. We need to address the pain and the hurts. And I am actually happy that we can talk about all kind of supremacy. Parents for Peace really helps people to understand and educate the general public that supremacy, any kind of supremacy, is rooted from victimhood, and also sometimes, and we think about it as a public health issue, because often it's an underlying issue that is being exploited. So thank you very much for joining us, and please don't hesitate to call us if you have any question or are interested in on our organization and our work. Thank you.